Today, we'll be talking about the diplomatic fallout surrounding the AUKUS deal. For those of you who don't know, the AUKUS deal is the Australia, UK, and US joint program of building the next generation of subs for the Australian Navy. And more specifically, we're going to talk about how the USA betrayed her French ally, who are the original awardees of the Australian subcontract. To explain this disaster and the ramifications for the world, I'm going to first address the common Anglo-centric misconceptions that are currently floating around in the news. For this purpose, I'm going to use an exchange on a recent discussion of Bill Maher's Real Time with Bill Maher show on HBO. To set the stage, though, let me warn you first. I'm going to delve into the different classification of naval submarines. So if you're already knowledgeable on the subject, or you simply don't care that much about those specifics and the engineering aspects of these submarines, feel free to skip to chapter 2, because I apologize, this is already kind of a pretty long podcast. So chapter 2 is around the 15-ish minute mark of this podcast. Let's have a listen.
And sometimes it's not bad to be America first. I mean, I don't understand why France is, maybe I understand why they're mad at us, but if you don't know what happened was France had a deal to sell nuclear submarines for defense to Australia. And at the last minute, we came in and offered them cheaper and better.
Exactly.
And they took it. Hey, that's the art of the deal, bitch.
Yeah,
You know what? I mean, sorry. We beat you at business fair and square. We didn't hold a gun to Australia's head.
Absolutely. And the thing is if France wants to sell their stuff, I'm sure Saudi would buy it. But at the end of the day, our stuff is far superior, so Australia would go with that. And it also
the one thing we
can
still do is make killing machines.
Yes, we can. Yes, but it also sends a message to China to let them know, we're in their in their neck of the woods.
Right. So we shouldn't feel bad about that one, right?
The French subs were so bad; they were really loud.
The what?
A loud submarine.
It's
from
diesel.
France.
It's diesel. Different. Ours is nuclear. Theirs is diesel.
Right. So
seriously?
Yeah. So theirs are these clunky
I feel even
things.
better about
yes.
this.
Yes.
How secrecy is that?
Yes. So not a good idea if you're trying to spy.
Did it leave,
they hear the bangs,
did
the
it leave
pops.
that black smoke?
Yes, it went down in a bit.
It didn't have truck nuts on it, did
Right.
it?
Exactly. So ours are quiet. They can spy. They can do some productive things. So, of course, the French had a hissy fit and left.
Ours can kill the whales so much more effectively.
Come on. Don't bullshit me. So, in one move, this is like Trump level of diplomatic fuckery, is how many allies Australia managed to piss off. Again, like if this wasn't real life, it would be comical. Welcome to Come On, Don't Bullshit Me, where we peel away the messaging of talking heads to get to the crux of today's issues. I don't like the excessive hubris of these people. I mean, they're shitting on the French submarine deal, or the lack of it now. They're like, oh, American submarines are technically superior, and that's why we won, which completely misses the whole point of why the French are pissed off. Because first off, you have to make a determination between which submarines are you talking about, because most people, when they think of submarines, they think of Hunt for Red October, and that's a ballistic missile submarine, or in U.S. Navy parlance, it's like SSBN. Without being too pedantic, there's, generally speaking, two separate classes of submarines, right? Yeah, I got attack submarines, and then you basically have Hunt for Red October missile submarines. I think the Navy community calls them boomers. Not like okay boomer, like baby boomers, but they're just ballistic missile submarines, and they call them boomers. If we're talking about hide and seek, the boomers are the hiders, and the attack submarines are the seekers, right? Their whole job is to go find the subs, find the boomers. So the boomers, their whole mission is to basically go on station and be quiet and just sit there. And obviously they do, because we're not under constant threat of World War III, they just go around doing missile drills As Sean Connery said on 3rd October, we will do missile drills and enjoy the company of Havana or something. And then all the Russian says like, yeah, or da. And then they were singing the Soviet anthem.
We will pass through the American patrols, past their sonar nets, and lay off their largest city and listen to their rock and roll while we conduct missile drills. And when we are finished, the only sound they will hear is our laughter. While we sail to Havana, where the sun is warm, and so is the comradeship.
And then, of course, the Sam Neill from Jurassic Park was Captain Vasily Borodin. And he's like, Captain, the noise will attract the imperialist pig dog Americans. And then Sean Connery's like, let them sing. So that's the purpose of the SSBNs, right? Their whole mission is basically be quiet, just have a Coke and smile and shut the fuck up. And if something happens, World War III happens, and if they get the order from their towed array, you got to launch the missiles. They're purely offensive. They're purely just there to ensure mutually assured destruction. If the Russians or Chinese or whoever, if someone launches nuclear missiles and destroys us, we have our submarines that can launch back. So you better not launch any missiles, right? So by the way, our nuclear triad is based off our nuclear silos, our land-based ballistic missiles, and then we have our strategic bombers that are always constantly up in the air. So if you launch missiles, they would fire, and then you have our SSBNs, missile submarines that are underwater, and then they will fire. It's kind of like the Silmarils from the Silmarillion. You had the 3 Silmarils. One would be lost into the sea, one would be in the air, and then one would be lost in the ground or fire, or whatever, earth. So that our nuclear triad could be based off of the Silmarillion. Thanks, J.R.R. Tolkien. So anyway, if World War III happens, we detect the missiles, the orders go out to the triad simultaneously. Everyone, the silos, the strategic bombers, and the nuclear submarines get the same order to launch the missiles. And the whole thing is, we hope that at least one out of those 3 entities is, still alive and can launch missiles back at the enemy. Because that's part of our nuclear triad. And I think the Soviets, or I guess the Russians and other countries, have similar things. With Britain, famously, they don't really have a specific code that they're supposed to monitor for launching missiles, but for them, they're supposed to tune into BBC 4, and then BBC 4 goes static. That means the UK is destroyed, so they have to launch their missiles, which doesn't really give me much confidence. I think the whole world is invested on making sure BBC 4 stays operational, because God forbid some pigeon shits on an antenna or something, and then World War III happens. Yeah, I'm sure there's fallback protocols, but it's a nice anecdote. At least I hope it's a nice anecdote. Then you got your attack submarines. They're basically like the apex predator of the sea. Their whole job is to find these very extremely quiet SSBNs and take them out. Well, during war, take them out. During peacetime, it's obvious to find them and then say, haha, we found you. You're not as stealthy as you think you are. So don't even try to think that you're going to rely on your SSBNs, because we're not going to knock them out of the sky, as we say in the Air Force, but we're going to take them to Davy Jones' locker or whatever the Navy says. So don't rely on your SSBNs when we nuke the shit out of you. Morbid discussions today. Anyway, under conventional war, their whole job is to infiltrate Navy carrier groups undetected and launch their torpedoes and sink mostly carriers, because that's the most valuable asset, but also other ships. Because right now, with current technology that humans have, nothing comes even close to the destructive power of a submarine, of an attack submarine. It's just unmatched. And obviously, the Germans figured this out during World War II. That's why the Kriegsmarine, they kind of divested away from capital ships and put almost all their effort and focus on attack submarines and sunk ships left and right. So the naval doctrine really hasn't changed that much, despite the advent of nuclear weapons. Is that with attack submarines, they're the apex predators in the sea, and no one even comes close as far as naval vessels are concerned, because obviously you have air assets and other things, but as far as the Navy is concerned, nothing comes close to attack submarines, and they can pretty much take out anyone. And their whole job is to be quiet enough to get close to the carriers or other naval assets and basically torpedo the shit out of them. So that's their point. So while SSBNs can be pretty quiet because they have the luxury of just sitting completely quiet in the middle of God knows what ocean and just sit and wait for World War III to happen, SSNs or SSKs, basically attack subs, they don't have that luxury because attack submarines are the seekers, right? Their whole job is to go find the subs, find the boomers. So again, there's generally speaking two separate classes of submarines. There's attack submarines and ballistic missile submarines, and the boomers. The boomers are the hiders, and the attack submarines are the seekers, right? And amongst those two, there is basically four designations. The attacks, you have the SSKs, diesel electric, and the SSNs, which is a nuclear submarine. And then with the ballistic missiles, you have SSBNs and SSGNs. SSBNs are nuclear ballistic missile submarines. And SSGN happened during I believe the START treaties, where during the denuclearization between Soviet Union, or I guess at this point it's Russian Federation and the US, we were required to get rid of 4 of our SSBNs and denuclearize them. So obviously we're not going to completely decommission these really nice submarines. These are, by the way, the Ohio class submarines for anyone who wants to be specific. And because of the START treaty or because of the U.S. Navy posture statement, the Navy were either forced to or of their own volition said, hey, look, we have 18 ballistic missile submarines, but in order to accomplish our mission, we really only need 14. So what we're going to do is we're going to denuclearize 4 of those submarines, SSBNs, and rather than just decommission them, we're going to use them for other things. So they replaced the Trident ballistic missiles with Tomahawk cruise missiles. So they're not ballistic anymore. They're cruise missiles, right? They cruise above the sea line and then go hit their targets, which you probably know if you remember the old CNN clips of the First Gulf War, First World War Tomahawks. No, the First Gulf War. Because, that was the first televised war. So 4 of those SSBNs were transitioned into SSGNs to use only conventional munitions. So again, that doesn't really matter, but I figure be thorough here. And speaking of thorough, I know there's going to be some random Navy guy that's listening to this, and I'm going to get a whole bunch of angry comments saying you don't know what you're talking about because we don't use SSKs anymore. And yes, I understand. Okay, in the interest of that one random Navy guy that's listening, yes, we don't do SSKs anymore because nowadays all submarines are expected to handle the anti-submarine warfare role. So really, we don't really have SSKs. It's mostly, your boomers, and then the attack submarines are now just SSGs. So they have those Tomahawks, and they are supposed to attack and destroy land and naval surface assets. I mean, if you look at the Australian submarines right now, they're not called SSKs, they're called SSGs, right? Without the N, because they're not nuclear. Yes, they have torpedoes, but their main focus is on the cruise missiles. But for this podcast, I'm just going to be fast and loose with terminology because I want to focus on nuclear propulsion versus diesel electric. And also, by the way, the new attack submarines that the Australians wanted, it's the attack class submarine. I figure it's just easier and more pleasing to the ear to call it SSK rather than SSG. And technically, the contract wasn't awarded, it was canceled, so we don't even know what the armament is. So I'm being a little cheeky there, but yeah, SSG, SSK. Bottom line is it's about diesel electric, and this is the thing that this whole AUKUS Fracas is about. This panel is a classic example of people being confidently incorrect, and they just don't know what the hell they're talking about. I don't want to call them idiots, but they're being idiotic, saying things like, "Oh, the French submarines are not as quiet as ours because they're diesel." Well, first off, you're a colossal moron. I mean, I shouldn't say that. That's not a nice thing to say. But I'll just say that they're being colossally moronic, because it's not like these subs are some sort of Mack truck big rig out in the middle of the ocean going, and then the Russians be like, "Captain, I hear a French sub on sonar. Are you sure, comrade?" It's like, "Yes, Captain, she sounds just like my truck in Vladivostok." It's like, no, they only run the diesel engines when they surface to charge up the batteries, and then they submerge all quiet-like and run on electric. So if you're talking about being quiet, diesel submarines are way quieter than nuclear submarines. The whole point of having a nuclear submarine is not about being quiet. It's about endurance, power, and indiscretion rate, or your indiscretion time. So endurance is basically how far you can go and how long you can stay on station. And power, well, we can talk about power later, but that's pretty self-explanatory. Now, indiscretion rate is specific to diesel electric submarines. Because the whole point of SSKs, these diesel attack subs, is that they use diesel generators. Well, they use electric motors. And as we know from Tesla, electric motors beat mechanical motors, hands down any day of the week, right? They're more efficient. And part of the reason why they're more efficient is they're quieter. Obviously, the more noise you make, the more inefficiency you have because of phonons being generated. But the point is, noise is a form of inefficiency, and electric motors are way quieter than mechanical motors. So these electric subs in and of themselves are extremely quiet. Now, the reason why they get a bad rap and why this panel is specifically talking about, they're not quiet as submarines, is not because of their operation. It's because of the fact that once the batteries are depleted in your SSK, in your diesel submarine, you have to go up to periscope depth and put out a snorkel and breathe in air so that your diesel engines can run. And then your diesel engines run and recharge your batteries. And that's what's noisy. And this is what's called the indiscretion rate. So if you can be submerged for 3 weeks, but then you have to come up for 8 hours. These are not real numbers, obviously, because I don't know them. But even if I do, I wouldn't be allowed to say anything. But your indiscretion rate would be, okay, every 3 weeks you have to be up surface to 8 hours, which is exposes yourself to being attacked by all manner of different naval ships, all manner of ways by the enemy. So the point is to minimize your indiscretion rate. So if your whole premise that the French deserve to lose this contract is because the French submarines are inferior, because they're less quiet or they're more noisy because they're diesel submarines, you're just being a colossal ignoramus, because it just proves that you would have no understanding of the fundamentals of submarine warfare or submarine propulsion. Nuclear subs are really good, but it's not because they're quiet. Diesel submarines are quieter than nuclear submarines because with diesel submarines, once they're fully charged, you can shut off the engines and the background noise is practically zero. Whereas with nuclear submarines, you have to constantly cycle through water to cool the reactor down. Anyone who watched Chernobyl or anything knows that nuclear power plants, nuclear reactors, require a constant flow of water to cool the reactor down to avoid a meltdown. You can't shut down a nuclear reactor. The nuclear reactions are constantly going, and there's constant heat buildup. So you have to constantly cool the reactor down to avoid a Chernobyl in your submarine. So if you want to talk strictly about being quiet, well, they're just completely wrong. It's just a matter of physics. These submarines are quieter than nuclear submarines. Now I know, okay, yes, the most recent Virginia class submarines, they've replaced the pumping of coolant with they call it conventional cooling, but obviously the details of that is classified, and so frankly, Right now, we don't know if it's quieter or not. If it is quieter, that's a huge, remarkable achievement that obviously is not going to be released to another country or let alone the public. And if it was that case, these talking heads wouldn't know about it. And if they did, well, then the FBI should be knocking on their door pretty soon. So as far as we, the public, are considered, it's a completely ludicrous statement to say, oh, the French lost because they had diesel submarines, and diesel submarines are not as quiet as nuclear submarines. It's just completely preposterous. So again, the whole point of nuclear submarines is not about being quiet. It's about endurance, power, and indiscretion rate. And one of the main points of nuclear propulsion is that it reduces your indiscretion rate to 0, because you don't have to recharge your batteries, so you don't have to resurface to recharge any batteries. You have nuclear engine, so you have nuclear power, and it's constantly on, and you don't run out of energy. The nuclear engine can last for about 10-ish years, so about 10 years based on the fissile material that's in it, right? And that's how most nuclear submarines, that's how they've operated, whether it's SSBNs or SSNs. And what the doctrine of the day was that, okay, submarines have to have a major retrofit. It's like a mid-cycle retrofit, so they do maintenance and where it basically involves completely replacing the hull and rebuilding again. It's almost kind of like a Theseus ship situation. And during that time, the prevailing thought was that, okay, well, if the submarine has to come in for this major retrofit, well, then we'll just put enough fissile material in there for about a decade or so, or whenever the major retrofit has to happen. It's a mid-cycle retrofit, and therefore it'll get upgraded systems, it'll get all the maintenance stuff and everything like that, and also we'll swap out the nuclear reactor or the fissile material with the nuclear reactor and replace it with a new one, so that could go on until the submarine gets decommissioned at the end of its life cycle. So that's the way it was. So with nuclear propulsion, the nuclear core was sized appropriately so that during these mid-cycle retrofits, that you could swap out the nuclear core and put a new core in and go on your way. For submarine nuclear reactors, they use highly enriched uranium, which allows the nuclear reactor to run for the full 30-plus year life cycle of the submarine. Now, this is not really a problem for the US or Russia or China or even the UK, because they're an established nuclear power when it comes to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But for other countries like, cough, cough, Australia, who are not nuclear powers, has a big issue. So that's just a minor point I wanted to make about the quietness, if you will, of the submarines, which is a complete preposterous point. But more broadly speaking, the panel was referencing that the reason why the French lost the contract, the Australian submarine contract, was because America came in and made a better deal. And that's just a giant, gross oversimplification of the entire issue. And if we really want to get into the nuts and bolts of it, which I guess obviously we're going to, because that's the whole point of this podcast, is we have to go back to the predecessor to the attack class submarine, which was the Collins class submarine. So the Collins class submarine was based off a Swedish design, and there was a huge, colossal clusterfuck of an acquisitions program. There were a lot of issues with it, but in retrospect, it was actually a really good program, because one of the reasons why it was a huge issue was because the prevailing doctrine for the Australian Navy was that prior to the Collins, they had the Oberon class submarine. And the Oberon class submarine was built by other country. So there was no in-house experience within Australia to maintain the Oberon class submarines. So anytime they had to maintain it, which was obviously often, because submarines are notoriously difficult pieces of engineering, and they require constant maintenance. So from a supply chain standpoint, Australia basically had nothing, and it was completely reliant on the UK. And one of their points that they made in the naval doctrine was that they didn't want to be reliant on another country for their strategic deterrence in the form of submarines, which is a completely legitimate and wise thing to do and to believe. So the Collins class submarine was to say, okay, we don't have any experience, but we got to gain this experience, and we're not going to recreate the wheel here and try to build our own submarine from scratch. So instead, we're going to partner with another country, and we're going to learn from them and get the experience here locally in Australia. And that's exactly what they did with the Collins class submarine with Saab, the Swedes. And there are a lot of issues with it because obviously trying to repurpose a submarine for another country, and not only that, but also build the in-house knowledge for the Australian government to be able to maintain these ships was a monumental undertaking. And obviously there was a whole bunch of cost overruns, and a lot of things that were promised weren't quite delivered. But overall, they worked through it, and a lot of the problems that plagued the Collins class submarine, to Australia's credit, the Navy worked on it, and to this date, the Collins submarine is probably considered the premier SSK in the world. Like, I don't think anything quite matches it as far as diesel submarines are concerned. So they learned a lot of lessons from that. Now, when they want to replace the Collins, because the projected life cycle or the budgeted or planned life cycle of the Collins submarine was only about 25-ish years. So by the time they got their act together about 5 years ago, we're already got to the point where, hey, we're nearing the end of the life cycle of the Collins and we need to replace it. And this was when there was a huge diplomatic fuckery, if you will, where the Australian Prime Minister had a really good relationship with Shinzo Abe, the Japanese Prime Minister. And he famously said that, hey, we love Japan and our strategic partnerships and everything's great. But most famously, he basically insinuated, though this was Prime Minister Tony Abbott, by the way, he basically insinuated that Australia would want to use the Japanese Soryu class submarine. Well, it doesn't matter what class it is, but basically, we'd love to have the Japanese build our next generation submarine. And obviously, this is a huge faux pas because he didn't consult with the military, he didn't consult with Parliament, and obviously, these type of things, you have to first get your guidance from the military on what it's actually their requirements. It has to be validated by the Parliament and voted upon, and also this has to go up to for a bid. You don't want to just unilaterally give this contract to a country. So once this happened, there's a huge big shitstorm, but the cat was out of the bag. So they said, okay, fine, we're going to open this up to bidding. And basically, famously, the United States did not bid on this, but the Germans bid on it, the French obviously bid, and the Japanese. And yeah, I don't think the Swedes bid on it. But basically, those were the three, I think, main candidates: the Japanese, the Germans, and the French. And one of the requirements of this was that, yeah, it has to be a diesel submarine, which obviously wasn't a problem for the Japanese and the Germans because that's what they use. They have SSK, diesel electric, and they were going to give SSK technology to the Australians. The French, on the other hand, they use SSNs, which is a nuclear submarine. So what the French offered was that they're going to take their Barracuda-class submarines, or Suffren-class submarines, as the French call it. But basically, they're going to take their SSN, and they're going to base the SSK design on this SSN and make it have a conventionally powered Barracuda, the short fin Barracuda. And the reason why they opposed this was because that's what the requirement was. The Australians wanted a conventional diesel electric submarine, so the French proposed a diesel electric submarine. It wasn't about the French being inferior or anything like that. It was just this is what the requirement was, and given the geopolitical situation of the day, it obviously made sense because Australia did not have a nuclear capability, and it wouldn't make sense to have an SSN because in order to have an SSN, you would need a whole nuclear infrastructure. You would need the engineers, you need the know-how, you need the facilities, you'd have to mine the uranium, have to enrich it, the whole life cycle of that, including disposal. You have to mine the uranium from like uranium ore and then, mill it into what's called yellow cake, which everyone remembers from the Colin Powell talks during Congress, and that's how Bush conned us into going to Iraq, was about Iraq allegedly had a yellow cake, which is the precursor to nuclear fuel or nuclear weapons. So anyway, from the yellow cake, then you have to enrich it so it can actually be used as a nuclear fuel. And then this is what actually matters, the enrichment process. Because natural occurring uranium is shit for weaponry or for fuel. You can't really use it because it's mostly uranium-238 with only about less than 1% U-235, which is the actual stuff that you need for nuclear propulsion, nuclear power, nuclear weapons, etc. And then so what you have to do is you got to take that yellow cake, which has, again, less than 1% 235, and then you got to enrich it so that it's useful for nuclear power. And typically for civilian cases, it starts off at 3% and then it goes up from there. And this is called, low enriched uranium. The issue is once you get to 20% enrichment, that's the theoretical minimum to create a nuclear weapon. And depending on who you ask, to actually create an engineeringly feasible nuclear weapon, you need about 85% to 90% enrichment of uranium. This is the whole issue with Iran right now that we're dealing with, because they're basically saying, no, we're using our uranium for nuclear power, which you obviously totally can do, but they're getting to the point where it's above 20%, and God knows how much percentage, but it's enough to create a nuclear weapon. And that's obviously an issue. So in order for Australia to have an SSN, they would need the enrichment capabilities to at least enrich this to a 3% range, right? The Brazilians, for example, they were considered a non-nuclear state. They didn't have nuclear weapons, but they developed their own nuclear infrastructure so that they can have an SSN, because the non-proliferation treaty does not prohibit nuclear power, naval nuclear propulsion. But the treaty specifically says that you can't just give nuclear technology to non-nuclear nations. So the Brazilians had to develop in-house their own nuclear capability, their nuclear infrastructure, to enrich the uranium to, I think it's like 7%, I think is what they use right now for their subs. And Australia would need to do the same thing. And the Australian government and the Australian people as a society have made a determination that they don't want that. So SSN was immediately off the table when they were looking for a Collins class replacement, because they weren't really interested in creating nuclear infrastructure and they didn't want it. So obviously it's, diesel it is. So again, this has nothing to do with about French technology being inferior or not. This is purely about the fact that Australia doesn't want a nuclear infrastructure, doesn't want to invest in that. And obviously it's in its right to do so. Now, going back to the Barracuda class ship, well, the French SSN is a technological marvel. Of course, I shouldn't be too flippant for what the panel said, because realistically speaking, obviously American technology, at least when it comes to military technology, is hands down superior to any other country. But even if they didn't know anything, which they clearly don't know based on their statements about it being quiet and whatnot, clearly they don't know, they don't understand anything about submarine technology. But you can excuse them, because it's a safe bet to say, hey, if I put a gun to your head and said who has the best military weaponry, you're probably going to say United States. That's a pretty safe bet. So I can't really shit on them too much for that. But the thing is, even though the U.S. submarines are a class above everyone else, that doesn't mean that the United States won this contract, which again, it wasn't even a contract because it was awarded to France, because again, the United States had been on it. But again, it doesn't matter, because even though the Virginia-class submarines are a technological masterpiece, it's not like the Australians are going to get the Virginia-class submarines. There's technological restrictions. There's the ITAR, which is the International Trafficking of Arms Regulations. Yeah, as great as an ally Australia is, a lot of our technology is just restricted, and we're not going to just freely give it away. So just because we make the best ships, and when we won this contract, doesn't mean Australia's going to get the best ships. It's not like we're going to give them Virginia-class submarines. I mean, look at the Joint Strike Fighter. As much of a debacle as that was, it's considered to be an international program, which obviously mostly the United States is funding it. And of course, yes, there are cost overruns, which we could talk about till the cows come home. But part of the considerations during the programmatics of the F-35, of the Joint Strike Fighter, is what technology transfer was going to be allowed and permitted for the coalition partners who are also investing into the Joint Strike Fighter. What were they going to get? Because the JSF that we're building for ourselves is going to be obviously going to be different than the ones that the UK, for example, is going to get. It's not even a contract, right? It's just a strategic agreement, partnership agreement. So we don't even know what the details are because the details are still not out there. It's too early to know about anything. And a lot of this stuff is TBD. So what happened was, from what we know, is that Biden has essentially talked with Toni Morrison. Well, no, not Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison is a novelist, by the way. Song of Solomon, great book. You should read it. Wait. Tony Abbott, Scott Morrison. Okay, Scott Morrison, the current Australian Prime Minister, they made a agreement for the procurement of a to-be-determined SSN for Australia to replace the Collins. That's essentially all we know right now. But it's safe to say that they're not going to get the Virginia for several reasons. Well, obviously, it's, other than the Seawolf, it's the most preeminent attack submarine out there. And just like we said about ITAR and FMS, foreign military sales, as great as an ally Australia is, there would be significant hurdles and be subject to many different regulations and laws on whether we could even transfer the technology to Australia. So that's that. But also, we have about 20 Virginia-class submarines right now, and we plan on ordering at least double that. So we're going to have like over 60 Virginia-class submarines. So we can't crank out enough Virginia-class submarines. So even if we were going to give the Virginias to Australia, which obviously we're not, but even if we were, we simply can't do it because we can't build them fast enough. So saying that, the French lost is because U.S. technology is better, it's a red herring. This is a classic case of what we talk about in this podcast about talking heads. They say one thing that in isolation sounds smart and reasonable and logical, but when you put it in its place with surrounding details, you quickly realize that they're full of shit. So, but then we gotta realize, okay, so this is not an Australian-U.S. relationship, right? It's AUKUS. So there's the UK in this as well. Well, what the hell does the UK have to do with this if this was a discussion between Scott Morrison and Joe Biden? Well, what we do know about the UK is that they have their own SSNs, and their SSNs are the Astute class. And one of the issues with the UK is obviously they've always been traditionally being a maritime power, of course, severely diminished since World War II. So that's a constant worry that they have to maintain their maritime expertise, if you will, within the country. But of course, they don't have the crazy unlimited budget that the United States does, so they have to make choices, sometimes painful choices for this. So whereas we can't, shit out enough submarines, the UK is not necessarily like that. In fact, they're about to build I don't know if they have finished building it or they're about to, but essentially they're about to build their last Astute class submarine, which is, again, Astute class is the British SSN. So they're ending that. Now, the worry is that for the UK is that because there are no more Astutes being built, then those factories are going to close down. Those people who are working on it, they're going to move on to other jobs, right, or retire or whatever. So that institutional knowledge of submarine building is going to be gone. So that in a couple of decades, when they need to replace the submarine for the next generation submarine, they won't have the expertise there to spin back up that capability. This is actually something that, again, I like to be fair here. This is not a left-wing podcast or anything, but the Democrats like to always complain about with our defense spending is that, we're constantly buying tanks that even the Army doesn't want. Well, again, that's not the point. Yes, the Army doesn't want them. The Army doesn't need tanks. We've gone away from armored cavalry as far as our main land doctrine. But the point is that Congress keeps ordering those tanks is because if we don't order those tanks, then those factories are going to shut down. So the point that in the future, when we actually do need to build tanks and build tanks in a hurry, we can quickly spin it up. And if we just let these guys shut down their plants and people retire and we lose all that, then at the point where we actually do need tanks, that's going to be an oh shit moment. And it's going to be in a deeper oh shit moment when we can't even build tanks because we've lost the know-how to do that. So going back to the whole efficiency question, not everything is about cost cutting and saving money and doing things that we need right now. A lot of it is just long-term value chain management. And that's exactly the problem that the UK is running into. But with this AUKUS program, this provides a golden opportunity for the UK to provide the Astute class submarine hull for the Australians, and therefore this gives a chance for the UK to keep their factories employed, and more importantly, it's not even on their dime. So chances are, given the supply chain considerations, the global supply chain considerations between the US and the UK, again, the details aren't known yet, but a reasonable assumption can be made that this new SSN is going to be based off of the Astute hull design. It's going to be a British design. It's going to be a UK boat stuffed with US shit. And I you say the word shit affectionately, which brings me back to the point of the French submarine. So yes, of course, the Virginias are better than the French submarines. But again, it's not a knock on the French. It just shows you how technologically advanced the U.S. military-industrial complex is. But the thing is, the guts inside the Barracuda are actually very comparable to the Virginia. So the sensor suite inside the submarine is comparable to the Virginias. So if you want to make the argument that, the French lost because American subs are better, well, that's also kind of a disingenuous argument, because we've already established here that it's most likely going to be a UK hull with US guts, and the US guts that are going to be it are comparable, or I should say anything that the French would provide in the sensor suite would be comparable to anything that the United States would be willing to provide. An emphasis there on willing, because obviously our best stuff is going to stay within US borders. So given all these considerations, okay, we might quibble on it. And again, all we're doing right now is just basically chickens pecking at each other, because we don't know the details of it. And even if the details do come out, they would most likely be classified. But from a civilian discussion perspective, that's all we can be right now, is we can essentially say that it's practically a wash, that the sensor suite that the French are going to give you are going to be comparable, we'll say, to what the Americans are going to give you. Now, going back to the original point here about why did they originally pick the French over the German and the Japanese, well, there's a lot of reasons for it. But most of the ones that we talk about is that the French ship, when you consider especially being that the French Navy is one of the few navies that actually uses SSN's nuclear attack submarines, obviously the technological know-how that the French have is going to be vastly superior to that of what the Japanese or the Germans have. So just like I said, it's pretty safe to say that the American technology is going to be superior to anyone else's. Well, it's pretty safe to say that the French technology is superior to anything that most other countries are going to have. You can argue between Russian versus French or UK versus French, but if I was going to do the Mount Rushmore of submarine technology, well, obviously US is going to be their number one, but then in some specific order for 2, 3, 4, clearly it's going to be France, UK, and Russia, and then everyone else is kind of off on the wayside. So, and obviously because of some unfortunate events in 1945, there's not exactly a good rapport of nuclear technology in Japan. It's changed, obviously, recently, but not to the point where the Japanese are cranking out nuclear naval vessels. Partly because of the culture of being anti-nuclear, which again, like I said, is changing, but also from the fact that their constitution that the Americans forced them to sign is that they can't really have an offensive naval capability. It has to be purely defensive. So for the doctrine of the Japanese, it doesn't make sense to spend all that money on not just the construction of nuclear submarines, but to have the nuclear infrastructure to accommodate the maintenance of nuclear submarines, because their Navy is a constitutionally mandated defense force. Now, of course, that's in the process of being changed right now, where there's being encouragement of altering the Constitution to make it more of an offensive capability, with obviously with the blessings of the United States. But that's something to discuss in the future, years from now. Well, as for Germany, Germany has only recently been reunited, so its capabilities to field such capital-intensive ships was limited, and also their Green Party is pretty dominant within their politics, and they have an anti-nuclear stance, which we can talk about in a future episode on the European Union's green initiatives and how they're shooting themselves in the foot with respect to nuclear energy. Germany also doesn't really have the need for nuclear weapons because, again, in the beginning of this podcast, we talked about the three discriminators of SSNs: endurance, power, and indiscretion rate. So we already talked about indiscretion rate. So let's go to endurance here. And for countries like Japan and Germany, endurance is not as big of a concern because, for primarily being defensive navies, they're not required to go out and be out at sea for long periods of time. And if they are, they're usually pretty close to the homeland. For Japan, obviously, it's because of their constitutionally mandated defense posture. And for Germany, it's just a simple matter of geography, which has always plagued them in World War I, World War II, where they have to get past the UK and France to actually physically be out there in the blue ocean. And now have divesting themselves from being a military power to being more of an economic one. There really is no need for a long endurance submarine that would necessitate the use of an SSN. France, on the other hand, having the largest economic exclusivity zone in the world, it requires a blue Navy force posture. So endurance is a big issue for it, which is why it has heavily invested itself in nuclear vessels. And United States and UK, of course, are no exception, being blue navies themselves, and the U.S. Navy being the preeminent blue navy, not only in the world, but in history. And of course, Soviets, or I should say the Russians now, inheriting the Soviet posture of being a blue force adversary to the United States, it makes sense for them to also have nuclear weapons. China is an interesting story because they mostly have SSKs, but they've been doing significant investments, obviously, in SSN, which goes against their propaganda that they espouse, is that, oh no, we're really here to protect ourselves. But now with them focusing on SSN, obviously that would be more for a blue water posture rather than a brown water, what we call brown water posture of being within littoral combat regions. So now for Australia, it's an interesting point because up until recently, within the past couple of years, Australia's doctrine has always been about national defense. And they've actually made it a point to criticize the United States and say, hey, look, we don't want to have an adversarial relationship with China because China's in our doorstep and we want to work with China as a geographic neighbor. So the need for an SSN wasn't really there. Now, as China has become more antagonistic over the years, the doctrine necessarily for Australia has changed to now the point where it says, well, no, we now need to recognize that China is no longer interested in being a peaceful neighbor within the Asia-Pacific region. We need to have a capability to not only defend ourselves, but project the force to make sure that we don't have a disastrous war. Because just like Germany has painful memories of the 1940s, so does Australia. The Imperial Japanese Navy did quite a big number on Australia. And so Australia is no stranger to the devastating effects of a powerful adversarial navy, which is why they need to take into consideration endurance, because the main submarine base of Australia is in Perth, which is in southwestern Australia, and it's about 3,000-ish miles to the South China Sea, which is where most of, presumably, Chinese naval operations are going to be occurring. Because that's part of their issue here of why Australia is under a change of its doctrine, because originally it wanted to have a kind of a cold friendship, if you will, or, lukewarm friendship with China because it's a regional partner and it's also one of the biggest trading partners of Australia. As China has become more adversarial, specifically with the Nine Dash Line. Nine Dash Line, by the way, for those that don't know, is basically this claim that the Chinese government submitted to the UN, where it claims all those random little tiny islands all around the South China Sea. And basically it says the entire South China Sea is under the naval jurisdiction or, authority of China. So if you don't know much about South China Sea, that means they're claiming not just the waters around mainland China, but all the waters essentially around Vietnam, all the way down through Singapore to Indonesia, Malaysia, back up towards Philippines, and then up from Taiwan to Japan. Basically, forget about the Southeast Asia international community. They're like, yeah, we're not splitting this with anyone. They're just taking everything. It's like that comic, that Garfield. He has a birthday cake with John Arbuckle, and then he cuts a little slice, and you think that's what he's going to take. But instead of taking a little slice for himself, he takes the entire pie and eats it and leaves a little slice for John. And that's basically what China is. China is basically the Garfield of the South China Sea. So that's kind of the issue, that China is basically tacitly threatening all shipping and naval activity throughout the South China Sea, saying that anyone who doesn't ask for our permission or we don't give a specific authorization to, without actually saying, we can basically sink you because this is all our territorial waters, which obviously is a big problem if you're Indonesia, Malaysia, Japan, Vietnam, Philippines, basically anyone, because you can't do any shipment through there. And if we're talking, Malacca Straits, 20% of the world's global shipping goes through the Malacca Straits, that's the straits between Malaysia and Indonesia with Singapore at the tip. So 20% of the world's global shipment goes through there. So it's kind of as Biden would say, it's a big fucking deal. And with that, I think it's 20% of global shipment. I think it's over 60% of Chinese. And I don't know what it is for Australia, but Australia being a Pacific nation, a lot of its shipment goes through there. So this focus on the South China Sea and this Nine Dash Line that China proposing is obviously causing a lot of adversarial problems. So going back to the point here is that from Perth to the South China Sea is around 3,000 miles. So the endurance that you would need to go there is pretty hefty, which means now it's not just about a territorial defense where SSKs should be sufficient. It's about actually operating in the South China Sea and providing a good deterrent against Chinese naval ambitions. And for that, yeah, sure, it does make sense that, okay, you would want to switch to an SSN as your main submarine force. So you would say, okay, well, doctrines change all the time, and especially with how long it takes submarines to be built, whereas on the U.S. is one of the faster ones where it comes around 6 years. But generally speaking, it takes about 10, 15 years from the initial contract award to the operational capability, the christening of the boat. A lot of things can happen within 10, 15 years. So it makes sense to say, well, you know what, the priorities have changed. And now, yes, they gave the initial contract to the French to build an SSK, but the SSNs make more sense. So that's why they picked the US. And that would be true, except for the fact that they're not a bunch of idiots. Most countries aren't idiotic, and they can read the room, as you would say. And they also know that, okay, SSKs don't really make sense. Not only that, but the French already have the capability of making SSNs, so it's a lot easier for them to make SSNs. And they also can see the writing on the wall, because they also have had a similar thing where most of the maritime territory of France is not in Europe. It's actually in the Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific region. So we may not really realize this as Americans, but France has huge territorial, geopolitical and economic concerns or interests in the Indo-Pacific region based on the sheer amount of territory that she has. So she also had this thing where, we want to be partners with China, this lukewarm thing where we don't antagonize them and just try to work with them as much as we can. But with the expansionist antagonism that China has done in recent years, they have also switched their doctrine to more of a, I wouldn't say blatant adversarial position against China, but definitely a tacit adversarial relationship with China. And because of this, during the whole process of the Barracuda submarine initial design review, they kept asking, there were reports, and even the French administration, the Macron administration, the French government has stated, they repeatedly asked the Australian government, hey, are you sure you still want to do the SSKs? We have the SSNs. We think SSNs will be better for you. And Australia was like, no, we don't want SSNs. We want SSKs. Even and now we're starting to find out they even said this, no, we don't want SSNs. At the same time that the Australians were talking with America, with Biden, with the Biden administration, saying, hey, so about those SSNs, it's kind of a pretty fucked up situation. It's kind of like, with Game of Thrones, where the HBO executives were realizing that season 7 and 8 were going to be a shit show because they only budgeted for 100 episodes, and they said, hey, if you want more money, if you want more episodes, if you want more seasons, we'll give you the money. Here you go. You can take as much time as you need. And D&D, the Game of Thrones directors were like, no, it's okay, we got it. We can wrap this up within 1-2 seasons max. It's like, are you sure you can have more money? It's like, no, we're good. And of course, they completely shit the bed on seasons 7 and 8. So it's kind of like that here with the Australians and with the French. So that's the point I wanted to make about the endurance. Now, the third point was power, which is kind of a minor issue here. But another advantage of nuclear propulsion is power. In that, again, like we talked about with diesel engines, you snorkel up to periscope depth, use your diesel engines to charge your batteries, and then you submerge, and then you use that battery power for all your operations, right? And then when they deplete, you have to resurface and recharge your batteries again. So the thing is, everything that you use is going to impact your endurance. So anything as innocuous as anything from using an oven in the galley to even, charging a sailor charging their laptop for, R&R, for rest and relaxation, reduces your endurance, because all that, whether it's the oven or charging the sailor's laptop, requires battery power from the main batteries of the submarine, which reduces the endurance of the submarine. So there's all huge power budget considerations that you have to worry about, which frankly, it doesn't exist with nuclear reactors, because nuclear reactors provide so much power that basically, not only do we not have to worry about ovens and sailors' laptops, but we're actually thinking about using all that excess power to shoot down drones in the sky with freaking laser beams, Austin Powers style. That's actually one of the acquisition programs being run in the DoD right now, is putting lasers on Virginia-class submarines for aerial drone warfare. So if you have enough power to use a laser, the amount of power that it generates is almost embarrassing. So that's that. And actually, this was one of the considerations of the French proposal, which is actually another reason why they won, was because they knew this and they purposely didn't use some ancillary technology that the Germans and the Japanese proposed. The Germans and the Japanese were proposing ancillary technology like AIP, which is air independent propulsion, and lithium ion batteries and fuel cells, combination thereof, to lower the indiscretion rate. And the French notably, they didn't do that. Their design was, we're just going to use the conventional diesel electric propulsion system along with your conventional lead acid batteries. But the thing was, because they didn't have to waste space with all this ancillary technology, and the fact that their hull was bigger, and because of their just naval construction expertise, even though they use, quote, the shittiest technology, which is, lead acid batteries, which is conventional, snorkeling for recharging, for running the diesel engine, their endurance was so much higher. And under normal operational parameters for an Australian submarine, the indiscretion rate was so low that the advantages of having an AIP or a more efficient battery, like, fuel cell or a lithium ion battery, didn't really matter. So that despite using the quote shittiest technology, the Australian Navy realized that, wow, as far as meeting the KPIs are concerned, that the French design blew everyone else out of the water. That's how good the French technology and French design was or is. And not only that, but because they didn't have all this other ancillary technology in there, the crew quarters and the amenities were much bigger. Because that's another interesting point here. Like, do you know what the weakest subsystem of a submarine is? Basically the limiting factor of a submarine's performance. It's the sailors, it's the humans in the submarine. So, especially with nuclear submarines, they can go on forever. And with a lot of these SSKs, these diesel submarines, they can essentially go on forever too. What limits the submarine's performance is the fact that the humans are cramped inside a metal tube without any sun or natural air, and in cramped quarters. And obviously they have to eat food, and everything. And so that's the limiting factor. And that's why we don't get a bunch of people going postal. And for the mental health of sailors, usually most navies limit the tour of duty for submarines to about 3 months, 90-ish days. Obviously, some are more extended, but that's basically the average. So the limiting factor of submarines is actually the crew's stamina. And that was actually one of the soft characteristics, if you will, of the French design, was that because they didn't waste all this space with other technology, and their base technology was so much better than everyone else's, they had way more room for crew quarters and crew living spaces, which, as far as for a human endurance or a human factors engineering standpoint, was monumental. And when you're talking about the limiting factor of a submarine endurance being the people, well, this is another added bonus to the French design over the German and the Japanese designs. So another criticism of the French deal was that of cost overruns. The reason that's a bullshit argument is because there hasn't been any formal cost estimation or report done by the Australian government. The actual details of that would, of course, be classified, but any broad scope general auditing of the program famously hasn't been done yet. And all the reports of 60 billion Australian dollars, which is about 42-ish billion American dollars, those cost overruns, a big part of this, again, because one of the lessons learned from the Australian Navy, from the Collins and even before that, the Oberon-class submarine, was that there needs to be the national infrastructure native in Australia to be able to do the maintenance on these submarines, to not be reliant on an external power. So especially if you're talking about building a French submarine, which has the guts of an American sensor suite, if you will. But again, the point is that it's a foreign-made submarine for Australia. They wanted to develop the in-house knowledge to de-risk that supply chain problem of not being reliant on a foreign power. And especially when you're talking about France is practically on the other side of the world. So having to sail your submarines all the way across the globe for their maintenance was obviously not only unacceptable, but impractical. So many of the cost overruns was the fact that because the Australian engineers didn't have the institutional knowledge of submarine shipbuilding, part of the cost overruns was sending these Australian engineers to France to get the know-how to build these submarines, and they reportedly were struggling on that. And so a lot of the cost overruns were due to the Australians themselves and not necessarily anything that the French were doing. So it's kind of disingenuous to say, oh yeah, there was a lot of cost overruns and it was a really expensive project, when a lot of that expense of the project was based on the specific requirements for the technology transfer from France to Australia. So a lot of these cost overruns were self-imposed by the Australians and not necessarily some sort of negative performance by the French. And another thing about these cost overruns, if cost overruns really are the issue here, well, here's the thing, and it's already coming out in the news right now, so it's already like how a colossal fuck up this is that The life cycle of the Collins submarine was only about 25 years, I believe, and they're rapidly coming to the end of their life cycle. And the Barracuda class submarines were supposed to replace them. Now, of course, they weren't going to make it in time, so they were considering extending the life cycle of the Collins for a couple of years, like 5-ish years or so that it would bridge the gap between the time that the Barracudas came online and the nominal end of the Collins life cycle. But now, because they completely scrapped the French design, that's 5 years of basically contracting of work down the tubes. And because we're going on this hybrid UK-US submarine model, that's pushed the procurement schedule for the next generation submarine even further beyond. And now the Australian government's saying, yeah, well, it looks like we're not going to even be able to extend the life cycle of the Collins, and we're going to actually have to get a new bridge submarine, new submarine to bridge the gap between the Collins and the new US-UK submarine. So what originally they were saying, oh yeah, cost overruns because of the blah, 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 because of the French, now they're actually going to have to spend even more money for a new alternate submarine to have in between the Collins and whatever the presumed AUKUS submarine is. So this is how much of a clusterfuck it is right now in Australia, and which is why, even if we don't consider diplomatic points, which we'll get to later, but they don't really have a leg to stand on when torpedoing the French deal. Not only that, but actually the day before this thing was announced, and this just shows you how shady the Australian government was acting, was because they have legal requirements, right? Because they signed up a strategic partnership between France and Australia. So when there were specific checkpoints that they had to go through to fulfill specific contractual requirements, and one of those things was a thing called the preliminary design review. And actually, so part of the strategic partnership, and this is one of the criticisms that Australians would levy on the French. I mean, I guess rightfully so, but the point here is saying that, hey, this wasn't a contract, this was a strategic partnership. And we specifically had clauses in here to opt out of the strategic partnership at specific times, milestones of the procurement process. And one of those procurement processes was after the preliminary design review. And what they actually did was, the day before this bombshell announcement came out, the Australian government okayed the preliminary design review of the short fin Barracuda to fulfill that strategic partnership requirement. And the very next day is when the bombshell news came out that they're ditching the French submarine. It would be hilarious if it wasn't so sad and real life. Now, why did this strategic partnership fail? Well, according to talking heads and the U.S. government, and more importantly, the Australian government, again, they have all these different excuses on, we want a nuclear submarine, even though that's bogus because the French offered that, and they met the KPIs and what have you, all these things that we just discussed. But quite frankly, it'd been just easier if they just acknowledged and said, hey, look, our strategic requirements have changed within the past 5 years or so with the accelerated antagonistic behavior of the Chinese, where quite frankly, our doctrine changed. So what we initially wanted out of the Collins replacement submarine now no longer implies, and we need a new submarine. And that's perfectly fine. But that's not what they said. Instead, you saw what happened was that they were basically saying one thing to the French and then secretly behind their back talking to the US and the UK on something else. So why did France actually lose their strategic partnership? If we have all these reasons why we just went through in detail on why that's not really the case, well, then what really is the case? Well, quite frankly, we don't really know. This story is still relatively fresh, and a lot of the discussion is going to be privileged communication, which we may never even know about. The details may never come out to the public. But the point here that's undeniable is that while there might be technical reasons that you could fall back on for the legitimacy of this, doctrinal reasons, which we talked about, that you could fall back on for going with the AUKUS deal. And we also discussed the legal points that you could fall back on and saying this wasn't a contract, this was strategic partnership, which, oh, by the way, with this AUKUS, that's still not really clear. just like with the debacle that Tony Abbott did with Shinzo Abe and saying, oh, yeah, we totally want Japanese submarines. And there was a huge uproar because there was no competitive bid for that. Does the AUKUS deal have to go through a new competitive bid? Are they just unilaterally saying, no, we're skipping that? Why was it not okay for the Japanese, but it's okay for the U.S.? So there's other ramifications to think about here. The Japanese are already sore from losing the bid in the first place, especially being courted with this whole bilateral budding relationship between Australia and Japan. But now all of a sudden they see that not only were they screwed out of this sweetheart deal with the Australian Navy, but the very thing that they were screwed on is now being granted to the United States and the UK. So what does that say for Australia's partnership with Japan as well? So this is not just about pissing off the French, you're also pissed off the Japanese. And oh, by the way, because this is a nuclear submarine, and New Zealand, their closest neighbor, famously has a policy where they don't allow nuclear vessels within their territory, you're also pissing off New Zealand because they're not going to allow you to dock your submarines anywhere near them or even sail your submarines anywhere near them. So in one move, this is like Trump level of diplomatic fuckery, is how many allies Australia managed to piss off. Again, like if this wasn't real life, it would be comical. So why did they do that? We don't know, but there's speculation. And we can go off of what most people in the know are saying, that this is part of Biden's or America's desire to disengage from Southwest Asia, basically this global war on terrorism, and to focus on the actual real strategic threat, if you will, of Chinese dominance in the Indo-Pacific region. And that's obviously, it's a very good thing that we are focusing on that, especially ending all these countless wars that don't amount to anything. And from the American viewpoint, this is a colossal win, because while it's about 3,000 miles from Perth to South China Sea, whereas from Hawaii, it's double that. It's about 6,000 to 7,000 miles from Hawaii to the South China Sea. So presumably, if your infrastructure is going to be built within Perth for accommodating nuclear attack submarines, when all of a sudden the American Naval Forces Pacific Fleet can now not just rely on Hawaii and Guam, which Guam is the facilities in Guam, being such a small island, are limited in itself, but now you're going to have a fallback base with Australia, and you can basically get on station twice as fast because it's half the distance. It's also, there's the Quadrilateral Alliance, or they call it the Quad, which the United States has been focused on, which is between Japan, Australia, India, and obviously the United States. And this is kind of a diplomatic encircling initiative to encircle China and counteract their expansionist aggressive policies with their own strategic alliance between India, Australia, and Japan. So it covers the entire, if you will, the semicircle, if you will, of the Indo-Pacific region. So with providing the submarine technology for Australia, this gives a good balance where we can have our ships, our naval assets, to not only to the South China Sea, but also into the Indian Ocean as well. Not being so reliant on the Suez Canal or going around the Horn of Africa. That's obviously a big win for us. So to blame the United States for doing this, I mean, that's not right either, because obviously it's in the United States' strategic interest to do this. And also, we have a lot of submarines, we have not a lot of naval assets, but strengthening our allies especially with our technology, means by having more capable allies, we can rely on them further for our own national objectives. I mean, this is one of the reasons why you want to have strong allies, so you can actually rely on them. And so this AUKUS deal is obviously going to be a huge win from that perspective. So no one's really criticizing, and even France recognizes this, right? They tacitly recognize that. That's not the issue. That's not the reason why France recalled their ambassadors. They canceled the gala, the 240th anniversary of the French and colonial forces defeating the English. The gala recalling ambassadors is because this is a colossal diplomatic faux pas. And this is the main issue I want to bring up, because anyone can be a monkey in the peanut gallery, as my dad would say, and throw shit at talking heads, especially when it's a live tape recording and they misspeak. The point here is the underlying thing that that these talking heads, that this panel was talking about here, is that somehow that the French are completely inferior and America is rightfully should initiate this AUKUS deal with a complete disregard to diplomatic protocol. And this is what the French foreign minister and even the French president said. And they said, this is the type of behavior we would expect from Trump. And again, not to bring politics into this, but from an international perspective, Donald Trump and his cabinet, specifically, Secretary of State, his diplomatic corps, was reviled, especially with this whole America First attitude. And Biden was supposed to be this breath of fresh air, restoring the diplomatic prominence of the United States to the Obama and even before years. And everyone was ready to welcome the United States back into the international community. With all these aspirations of America returning back to the international scene, to come around and basically stab France in the back, as their foreign minister said, is just inexcusable. And again, here, this is not about shitting on Americans saying that, America didn't have the right to do this. Of course, America had the right to do this. And as we discussed, it makes perfect sense from a doctrinal standpoint. But it's kind of like that Jeff Goldblum scene in Jurassic Park where he says, you guys were so concerned with, I'm butchering the quote, but it's like, you guys are so concerned about whether you could, you didn't stop to think whether you should. Let's talk about the dinosaur eggs.
Yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
And that's exactly the point here. We have a Jeff Goldblum situation in that, yes, the United States could do this, but should we have done it? And it's not just even that. It's not even just should we have done that. It's just, when I say should we have done it, it's not about should we have done the AUKUS deal. It's about should we have conducted the AUKUS deal in a manner that we did, namely, as the French would say, as we stabbed them in the back. Because the whole point is the French government was asking, okay, how's everything going with the Barracuda program? And there's these text messages from Macron that apparently got leaked onto Twitter that people can read about. And Scott Morrisman, said, oh yeah, everything's good. He didn't say anything. There was the whole discussions at the G7 this year where Macron and Biden were talking and, getting all chummy with each other, having a good time. And not once did Biden take Macron to the side and say, hey, by the way, there's this thing happening with the submarines. I just want to let you know, give you a heads up. Bad things happen all the time on the international stage, but especially with allies, it's considered good protocol to give people a heads up. And actually, this is not just diplomacy. This is just good general life advice for anyone. At work, we say, hey, if you have a good boss, you just say, hey, I don't mind if something bad's going to happen. If it's going to happen, just give me a heads up before it does happen. So if I was king for a day, if I was, Biden, what I would have done was, okay, AUKUS is happening. That's fine. But at least tell Macron beforehand and say, hey, look, this is happening. And obviously Macron's going to be furious about it, but he's saying it in private. And this will give an opportunity for both France and the United States to either work something out where France is still part of this deal, or even if not, worst case scenario, France is completely out of it. But then at least you give France an opportunity to save face. And the way to spin that story is painfully obvious, where we say, hey, look, in the past 5 years, again, you could just blame everything on China. In the past 5 years, China has been very aggressive. You don't even have to mention China if you're worried about ruffling feathers, but you could say, hey, in the past 5 years, the strategic requirements or the strategic realities of the Indo-Pacific region have changed. We're to the point where a conventional sub like the Barracuda does not make sense, or you can make some other reason to basically say that, hey, look, this doesn't work. And even the French could say, look, we tried to do this, but there's too many issues with the technology transfer, where the Australian engineering community cannot assimilate our technology, and also there are concerns with intellectual property transfers. Point here is that you can make 100 bullshit statements like this, basically save face, and then France would say, because of these realities and hardships or problems, we've decided to pull out of this this strategic partnership with the Barracuda, and focus our efforts on other things and strengthening our relationship with Australia in other aspects or something like that. But the fact that I come up with this and say this, in the span of 5 minutes means that the United States government in its infinite wisdom and resources should be able to come up with that thing too. So, Fox News and them, they like to talk about and like shit on, hey, look, this is such a colossal fuck up by the Biden administration with the pullout of Afghanistan. And in some respects, they're kind of right on that. In this case, this is like completely no excuse. That the diplomatic fuck up of the AUKUS deal is just completely inexcusable, and it just further underpins what a lot of our allies, specifically our European allies, are saying, that the United States has fundamentally changed since the election of Donald Trump, and Biden is no different than Trump. And he actually, even before Trump, because they were saying this about Obama as well, is that since the election of George W. Bush, the United States has been becoming increasingly antagonistic, which means our adversaries are also becoming increasingly antagonistic. It first started with the Iraq War, which obviously famously France was against. Remember that whole freedom fries versus French fries debacle that happens? That started with that. And then they thought, Europeans, and specifically the French, thought, okay, with Obama, things were going to change. And they, welcomed with open arms. And of course, Obama continued the war, even despite his campaign rhetoric of Afghanistan being the good war and Iraq being the bad war. He still continued that. He still continued with the drone strikes, which the international community objected to. Even from a Russian perspective, this is not just about our allies, but even from the Russian perspective. There was the famous reset where Hillary Clinton brought the reset button. Button's like, hey, look, we're reset. And it didn't reset. So this is just a continuing pattern for almost 2 decades now, where the United States, from on the diplomatic standpoint, has been constantly screwing up. And where most countries obviously don't have the military or martial power that we do, they rely on, diplomacy is a big thing. As a matter of fact, it's a big thing for us too. So at the G7, Biden should have pulled Macron to the side and told him in private that this was what's going down. And someone might make the argument, well, it's not really the United States' concern because it's not America's message to give, it's Australia's message to give because it's the partnership between France and Australia. But that's a very obtuse take on it because, again, in diplomacy, and especially with supposed friends, this is not something you do. And again, this is the whole point of private conversations, is that you bring someone to the side and tell them, hey, this is the things that's happening, because if this happened to you, you wouldn't like it either. So I dismissed the argument and saying, well, it's not really Biden's fault, it's Australia's fault. That's just it's a colossal abdication of responsibility, especially for the world's only superpower. If you're talking about with great power comes great responsibility, well, one of the responsibilities of a superpower like the United States is to manage its diplomatic relations with its allies. The bare minimum is to inform them of things in private. So I dismissed that argument out of hand. So there's this feeling in the international community for about 2 decades. Again, it has nothing to do with politics because they criticize both Republican presidents and Democrat, and we had 2 of each, which crystallized with Trump saying America first. This America first mentality means that our allies can't trust us anymore. And then now I know, like, some of you people are saying, oh, well, you're so stupid. Of course it's America first, because all countries are their country first, because they have to take care of their interests first. Yes, okay, I understand what you're saying there, but that's not really the point here. The point here is that, of course, America has to care about America first, but when you're talking about diplomatic circles, you certainly don't shout that off to the rooftops. It's about having the diplomatic chutzpah to work with your allies and to address their concerns. And even not just your allies, but your enemies as well. Or I shouldn't say enemies, but your adversaries as well. But specifically your allies. The only time that the America First policy was a legitimate diplomatic course was essentially during our first 50 years of our existence, which was culminated, or I should say, which crystallized with the Monroe Doctrine. It was that, hey, we are United States. We're not going to bother with the affairs of Europe, and Europe, likewise, you guys are not going to bother in the affairs of the Americas. So we leave you alone and you leave us alone, right? That's where America First is appropriate. And that carried on through to all the way up into the 1940s, where we've always had an isolationist standpoint. We didn't want to get involved with World War I. That was Europe's problem, not ours. But then we got sucked into it. But then even after World War I, we got sucked into it and said, you know what? We're still getting out of there. America first. We don't want to deal with your guys' crap. We're doing our own thing. And then only after the Second World War happened, the advent of nuclear weapons, we realized, okay, this whole America first attitude is not really working. We have to be the world's policeman. And again, you can criticize the United States being the world's policeman and everything like that. That's fine. It's a fair criticism for you. But the point here is that because we've adopted that as our foreign relation posture, if you will, we don't have the luxury to say America first anymore, because by being the world's policeman, we have to ensure that we have proper allies, because we can't just do it alone. And especially if we're taking our adversaries seriously, like Russia and China, then we have to make sure we have our allies on our side and not constantly push them to the side of our adversaries. I mean, the classic point here is with Turkey that a lot of people are talking about, is that how the West has constantly pushed Turkey away from the West, and now Turkey is chumming up with China and Russia. And same thing can be said with India. That's another point here, is that, hey, we're reliant on, look, India needs to be a good ally. Originally they were kind of a tacit ally of the Soviet Union, but after the Cold War, there's a good opportunity to bring India into the fold of the Western sphere of influence and being a really good ally. And then we started pissing them off, especially dealing with Afghanistan and necessarily having to chummy up with Pakistan, their own primary adversary. But with this constant diplomatic faux pas that we've been doing, even India now is looking at saying, hey, you know what, maybe China, even despite the adversary relationship that India has with China and Russia, they are going after relationships with those countries. Famously right now, I think India is looking at getting the S-400 missile system. The other thing is, okay, it may be also America first, which again, I just pointed out here that it really isn't, because being the global policeman, being the global superpower, where you have to be reliant on our allies, but also America has always been the foundation of America. It's our national ethos, if you will, has always been about international maritime trade, the free trade. And a lot of our prosperity comes from our close relationship with European nations. And we've done a pretty decent job of, despite everything that I just said, we still have very good relationships with the European Union. But two things have happened recently. One, Brexit happened. So now one of our staunchest allies, practically brothers in arms, if you will, the Brits, are no longer part of the European Union. So we can't rely on them as our foot in the door with Europe. But secondly, Angela Merkel has stepped down after 15 or so years. The reason why I mention that is because up until recently, Germany has pretty much dominated the European sphere of influence. So if anything's going to happen with Europe, we pretty much had to run it by Germany. And now with Merkel leaving, well, there's essentially, I wouldn't call it a power vacuum, but I guess you can call it a power vacuum in Europe or in the European Union, which France is very eager to pick up, and some may argue have already picked up. And this is a lot of things that Macron has been doing in the international circle, is showing the prominence or the reemergence of France as a, if not a global power, definitely a regional power or a multi-regional power here. So if we've already acknowledged and established that part of our fortunes as Americans comes from our close relationship with the Europeans, and if France is now the de facto gatekeeper of Europe, well, then maybe we probably shouldn't be pissing off France with these type of diplomatic faux pas. And not only that with Europe, but again, like we established earlier in the podcast, is that most of France's maritime territory is in the Pacific Ocean, and they are also agitated by the Chinese aggression. So having them on our side not only is good from a commercial standpoint, from a European trade standpoint, but also from our self-admitted foreign policy objectives in the containment of Chinese aggression. So shitting on France, especially in such a public manner of saying, hey, look, we did the AUKUS thing, and completely blindsiding them and not allowing that to save face, is just, It's not even America first. Even if this is America first, this is not America first because we are actively harming ourselves. We're harming ourselves because we're harming our ability to engage in trade deals with Europe, because now France is going to veto a lot of things, any deals that we would want to do with the European Union. But also it's harming our foreign policy objectives in the Indo-Pacific region, because we need France as an ally to counter the Chinese threat. So even from an quote American first standpoint, we have to realize America first is not America just bulldoze over everyone. America first is that we have to use our diplomatic strengths to bring along the entire world to isolate from the aggression, Chinese aggression. This brings me to my final point about the diplomatic faux pas. And this is specific to the fact that we are giving nuclear technology to Australia. So, okay. Originally, earlier in the podcast, we talked about endurance of submarines and specifically nuclear weapons. And this wasn't just me pontificating about nuclear weapons. There was a reason to this, which now I'm finally getting to. That is that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that we are signatories of, that most countries are signatories of, prevents the transfer of a lot of weapons-grade nuclear technology to non-nuclear nations, which Australia is a non-nuclear nation. And this is actually one of our beefs that we have with North Korea and Iran, right? Especially the thing with Iran is that a non-proliferation treaty, the NPT, says that every country has the right to pursue peaceful nuclear technology for their energy needs. And this is why I discussed the difference between low enriched uranium, which is between 3 to 20%, and weapons grade uranium, highly enriched uranium, which is from 20 to 90+%. And this is our thing with Iran, is that we're claiming, oh no, they're enriching it beyond 20%. So this is violating the NPT. And also, more importantly, they're going to use this to make weapons to launch at Israel or whoever else. So what does this have to do with submarines? Well, again, so I mentioned there's two countries or non-nuclear countries that will be using SSNs right now. One is obviously Australia, which we just talked about. And then the first one is Brazil. But Brazil's nuclear submarine uses low enriched uranium. And not only that, but it's technology that they developed themselves. Again, from their free right that's recognized from the NPT to develop nuclear technology for peaceful means, they've been able to now parlay that, obviously with some assistance from France, which, oh, by the way, Australia, if you're talking about needing a country that can actually do this, well, obviously France has already done this with Brazil. But again, the point here is that Brazil has done this, but without violating the Non-Proliferation Treaty, because it's homegrown technology that they developed, and now they're parlaying that into nuclear propulsion. But also, these SSNs, they're using low enriched uranium, which means it's non-weapons grade, which is adherent to the NPT. And similarly with the Barracuda, this is, one thing that is a drawback that both Australia and the United States would say was like, oh, well, it doesn't really matter, because even if Australia took the Barracuda, took the original SSN design of the Barracuda, well, their nuclear reactor or their nuclear core is only good for 10 years and it requires a mid-cycle maintenance where to swap out the core for a new one. And Australia doesn't have the nuclear infrastructure for that, and we don't really want that. But the United States, their Virginia submarines are, and as well as the UK Astute ones, because again, we don't know which one is going to be used, but the US Virginia technology, the life cycle of the nuclear core is like 33 years or whatever. But let me ask you, how is it that the nuclear core of the US submarine is 33 years while the French one is 10? Well, I'll tell you why. It's because the U.S. Nuclear core, nuclear propulsion, uses highly enriched uranium. So by us giving highly enriched uranium to the Australians, a non-nuclear nation, because they don't want to do mid-cycle maintenance, well, that's a violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, because now we're handing a non-nuclear nation weapons-grade uranium. It's a clear violation of the NPT. Now, of course, This is going to be spun in different ways, saying, no, it's not really a violation because we're not actually giving the technology, the know-how to the Australians, and it's going to be they'll probably say it's going to be a completely sealed module because this is how submarines are built. Actually, I encourage anyone who's really interested in this to go to submarine shipyards and see how subs are built, but they're basically built like different modules. So you have cylinders that it's kind of like a Christmas Yule log. So it's basically a slice of Christmas Yule logs. You have a bunch of different slices, and they bring them all together. So submarine construction is kind of very modular designed. Anyway, so you'll have basically a Christmas Yule log slice of the nuclear reactor, and that's going to be completely sealed, right? And because it's going to last the entire life cycle of the new AUKUS sub, that the Australians will never go into it. It'll be completely sealed. They won't go in there. So technically, we're not really violating the NPT. This is how I imagine that this is going to be spun. What we know from experience is that given an inch, countries like Russia, China, Iran, basically all our adversaries they take a mile. And now, you bet your ass, China and Russia are going to use this and say, oh, well, the United States is giving highly enriched uranium to Australia. So that means now we can start giving it to other people. So now Russia's going to say, hey, Pakistan, hey, India, hey, Iran, you guys want highly enriched uranium? Well, here you go. And it's like, oh, no, it's not a violation because wink, wink, it's totally sealed. And we're going to give it to you, and it's not a violation. And then the United States, we're not going to be able to say shit because we already did it with the NPT. Not only did we fuck up by not telling France and doing all this stuff, but even when the news was broken out, there was no initial preemptive press release, if you will, or discussion from Biden saying, hey, we're going to give this highly enriched uranium to Australia, but it's not a violation of NPT for these specific reasons. So he wasn't preemptively clear about that. So because the initial media hoopla of the AUKUS deal happened without such an explanation, even if it does happen later on, doesn't matter, it's because it's going to get lost. And Russia and China are already going to have the built-in excuse, well, the United States already violated the NPT, so we're going to do whatever the hell we want to do. So when we're talking about just global destabilization from nuclear proliferation, we're not really doing ourselves any favor. And if preventing proliferation of nuclear weapons is not America first, I don't know what is. If you would like to comment on this podcast or on the topics covered within it, or you'd like us to raise a new topic in our next episode, please feel free to leave us a message or voicemail on www.codbsm.com. That's Charlie Oscar Delta, Bravo Sierra Mike.com. Thank you for listening and see you at the potty, Richter.